Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Lanschum. And I would like to thank my hosts again for inviting me, and I think it's a very big honor that I can be here and I'll present my second lecture. The first lecture showed some interrelationship between cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics, and today I will show you, from a more or less kind of typological perspective, what you can do if you combine linguistics and cognitive sciences, and this here is a talk in cognitive linguistics. I want to talk about nominal classification. The problem of classification is a general problem of life. The classification abilities are necessary for the survival of every organism is an important insight of biology. Human beings classify consciously, unconsciously, and even subconsciously in all situations. And when we confront a scientific problem, we try to solve it by first classifying the various parts of the problem. Therefore, the history of all branches of science is also the history of how these sciences have classified their research subject. Classification always implies selection too, because as Arthur Koestler put it once, our minds would cease to function if we had to attend to each of the billions of stimuli which constantly bombard our receptor organs. The nervous system and the brain itself function as a multi-level hierarchy of filtering and classifying devices which eliminate a large proportion of the input as irrelevant noise and assemble the relevant information into coherent patterns before it is represented to consciousness. If we want to communicate about this perceived, classified and filtered input, we have to classify once more. We have to transform this input into classes and categories provided by the systems that organize our communicative verbal and non-verbal faculties. Thus, this second step of classification leads to categorization on the semantic level. With our systems of language and gesture, we again classify, filter and categorize on various levels while communicating. Linguistics is the science that tries to analyze these processes of classification that are relevant for communication. Indeed, the languages of the world provide an enormous data pool for the analysis of this problem, and humankind has developed a number of different linguistic techniques to apprehend our world. By the way, as a German, we have learned that we always have to refer back the origins of these sciences to ancient philosophy, and indeed there is a prototypical researcher on classification, namely the philosophical discussion of nominal classification can be really traced back to the sophistic philosopher Protagoras, who lived in the years 485 till 440 before Christ. In what follows, I will briefly discuss the basic problem of how the perceived world is expressed and represented in language, and how language refers to the perceived world. Then I will present and illustrate the various systems or techniques of nominal classifications in the languages of the world. I will end this presentation with a discussion of some central problems of nominal classification, most of which are still unsolved. Well, one of the basic questions in the study of language is how the perceived world is expressed and represented in and through language, how language refers to the perceived world, to its objects, things, and living beings. We not only perceive the world, but we also develop concepts about what we perceive and create linguistic expressions that refer to and represent these concepts. These expressions refer to actions, to temporary states, things and objects, persons, other living beings, and so on and so forth. Many of these expressions are classified by linguists as nouns, and in many languages, these nouns, like verbs or adjectives, constitute an open word class. Greenberg claims that as soon as we wish to talk about an action as such, we nominalize it. Then Talmy points out that languages generally subcategorize nouns grammatically along certain semantic parameters. These subcategorizations are classifications, of course. And the question why most of these classifying systems apply just to the noun phrase rather than other syntactic constituents was answered by Joseph Greenberg in a very convincing way. It is the noun, par excellence, which gives rise to classificational systems of syntactic relevance. It is not so much that the noun designates persisting entities as against actions or temporary states. It is that nouns are continuing discourse subjects and are therefore in constant need of referential devices of identification. Classification is a help in narrowing the range of possible identification. Gerlach-Roym did pioneering research in the field. Then Hans-Jakob Seiler and his co-workers tried to integrate the various techniques of nominal classification into an overall framework, and Greenwald and Sascha Eichenwald proposed new typologies for these systems of nominal classification. And Walter Pisan also did his part in that work. The following overview of nominal classification systems found in the languages of the world follows Gerlach-Roym's maxim: we can speak of nominal classes only if the mental grouping of nouns is formally reflected within the language in one way or another. That is one thing where Professor von Jung and I absolutely agree. And I just would like to make a comment. Gerlach-Roym has written a book in German, unfortunately, so it's not translated. It's a book of 1,200 pages, and he uses original quotes from all kinds of Indo-European and classic languages. When I read this book, I read it like a detective story. It was one of the most enlightening monographs for me that influenced me on my approach to nominal classification. Okay. The Greenwald's lexical grammatical continuum systems of nominal classification is basically a line that goes from lexical to grammatical, where you have on the lexical side measure terms and class terms, and on the grammatical side noun classes or gender systems. And in between are various systems of classifiers. And you have differentiations between mensural classifiers and order classifiers. I will come back to this kind of differentiation in a minute. In this table of Greenwald's, lexical means part of the lexicon and its word-building dynamics, and semantically compositional, while grammatical means part of the morphosyntax of a language. Now, let's have a look at measure terms and class terms. Greenwald differentiates between the two systems of lexical nominal classification, namely measure terms, and these measure terms are lexical in the sense that they are semantically compositional analytic noun phrases. And class terms are lexical in the sense that they operate on derivational or compounding morphology at word level. Now, let's discuss measure terms a bit. Measure terms express quantities, like English, a glass of whiskey, a slice of bread, a group of children, a school of dolphins. Distinguishing measure terms from numeral classifiers is a recurrent problem in numeral classifier languages, and we will come about that again. Then class terms. Again, Greenwald defines class terms as classifying morphemes which participate in the lexicogenesis of a language. The plant world is probably the most common semantic domain of class terms. Thus, we find morphemes like berry or tree that classify nouns like strawberry, raspberry, palm tree, and oak tree. In English, we also find derivational morphemes like is and er and man to designate classes of agents, as in scientist, novelist, baker, writer, postman, and fireman. Again, distinguishing class terms from noun classifiers is a problem in many languages, like, for example, in Australian languages or in Thai. Now, what about noun class systems and gender? They are the second big group. Noun class systems is the first group that I wanted to discuss. In noun class systems of nominal classification, all nouns of a language are assigned to a number of classes. These systems are typical of languages of the Niger-Congo linguistic stock, especially of Bantu languages. They are characterized by agreement with constituents outside the noun phrase, by a higher degree of grammaticalization, evident in a closed system of a small number of classes, and by a lesser degree of semantic transparency. For Proto-Bantu, 90 noun classes have been reconstructed. The classes 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, 7, 8, and 9 and 10, for example, are singular and plural markers. The noun class systems of modern Bantu languages consist of 12 to up to 20 morphological classes. I just would like to give you an example for a noun class system in the Bantu language Sesotho, Bashanyana, Bane, Bafuma, Ne. That means 2 boys. Then we go on. Iperekisi, Se Monate, and then this translates, those boys found some tasty peaches. And you have by boys and the demonstrative, the morpheme ba as a noun class marker, and you find the agreement marker for second subject, and then you find the marker for peaches, D, and D that classifies the peaches in a way of how they are perceived by the taster properly. Here the demonstrative modifying the class 2 subject noun Bashanyana is the class 2 demonstrative Bane. The subject marker on the verb then agrees with this nominal subject. The nominal modifier for the class 10 noun D, Perekisi, takes the class 10 relative prefix Se Monate. Gender systems, which are found in Indo-European and Semitic languages, for example, are defined by Graf Corbett as the type of nominal classification which is reflected beyond the nouns themselves in modifications required of associated verbs. The determining criterion of gender is agreement. This is the way in which the genders are reflected in the behavior of associated verbs. Saying that a language has 3 genders implies that there are 3 classes of nouns which can be distinguished syntactically by the agreement they take. It is not only adjectives and verbs which can show agreement in gender, but in some languages adverbs agree in other numerals, and sometimes even conjunctions agree in gender. Taking agreement as the defining criterion for gender implies for Corbett that there are no grounds for drawing a distinction between languages in which nouns are divided into groups according to sex, and those where human, non-human, or animate, inanimate are the criteria. Thus, many languages described as having noun classes fall within our study on gender. Languages which gender obligatory classify all their nouns into formal classes. And gender systems are the most limited systems of nominal classification with respect to the number of their classes. Klingwald illustrates the limited semantic motivation of assignment to classes beyond that linked to sex and animals by the different gender assignments of the name of common objects in French and Spanish. So we find in French un mur, which is masculine, and in Spanish una pared, and both of these, which is feminine, and both of these translate as a wall. Again, in French we found la fourchette, which is feminine, and el tenedor in Spanish, which is masculine, and which translates both as the fork. Keith Allen states that by and large, European gender is semantically empty. However, more recent work on gender contradicts this statement, pointing out that gender is never semantically empty. There is always a semantic core, usually masculine, feminine, or human, non-human. Now let's come to classifier systems. Many languages use specific classifying morphemes, so-called classifiers, for the classification of their nouns. And you see here from that map from the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures how many classifier languages we find in the languages of the world. And they only had as a basis for their corpus 200 languages, and we have about 5,000 to 7,000 languages in the world at the moment. So many of the classifier languages that exist are not even yet described, and we do not know of them. These classifier languages, are distributed all around the world, belonging to such different language families as the Malayo-Polynesian, the Austro-Asiatic, the Sino-Tibetan, the Altaic, the Dravidian, and the Indo-Aryan language families. Moreover, we also find classifier in sign languages, like for example in American Sign Language, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and Mesopotamian cuneiform. In classifier languages, nominal referents are classified according to specific characteristics of their reference. And this kind of classification is based on semantic principles and results in the ordering of objects, living beings, concepts, actions, and events. In other words, this classification leads to a categorization of all the nominal conceptual labels coded in such a language. The units of this classification are semantic domains, according to Brent Burling. Thus, on the basis of semantic considerations, classifiers can be grouped together and then be regarded as constituting certain semantic domains. The semantic domains constituted by these classifiers represent the semantic structures or substructures of a classifier language. Greenwald points out that the characteristic of classifier systems is that they constitute grammatical systems of nominal classification in the intermediate range between lexical and morphosyntactic extremes. Now, we have a number of different classifier languages, and the most known, I think, and the most prominent probably, two are numeral classifiers. Numeral classifiers represent the type of nominal classification that Keith Allen considers to be the paradigm case of classifier languages. Numeral classifier systems can be found in the languages of Southeast Asia, in East Asian languages, in languages of the Americas, and in Oceanic languages. Classifier languages have a system that can be, at least in principle, an open set of classifiers. They follow the almost universal principle that runs: a classifier concatenates with a quantifier, a locative, a demonstrative, or a predicate to form a nexus that cannot be interrupted by the noun which it classifies. Here we agree there. Language with numeral classifiers differ from other languages primarily with respect to the following characteristic feature. In counting inanimate as well as animate reference, the numerals obligatorily concatenate with a certain morpheme, the so-called classifier. This morpheme classifies or quantifies the respective nominal referent according to semantic criteria. Therefore, linguists generally differentiate between classifiers proper and quantifiers. These classifiers and quantifiers are usually defined as follows. Classifiers classify a noun inherently, that is, they designate and specify semantic features inherent to the nominal denotatum, and divide the set of nouns of a certain language into disjunct classes. So we have in Mandarin Chinese, I don't dare even to express this, one classifier letter or letters, one letter. Quantifiers classify a noun temporarily, that is, they can be combined with different nouns in a rather free way and designate a specific characteristic feature of a certain noun that is not inherent to it. So, for example, we have 10 classifier pound meat, 10 pounds of meat. Besides the terms classifier and quantifier, we also find the terms sortal classifier and mensural classifier. There are a number of other terms that try to describe and specify classifiers. So this differentiation of classifiers is in itself a form of classification. It results in the claim that there are different categories of classifiers. However, and I really want to underline this, however, with respect to this claim, I would like to maintain with Greville Corbett the requirement that to demonstrate the existence of a category, evidence of distinctions in forms is necessary. Now, Kilivila, the language that I've been researching for more than 30 years by now, is the Austronesian language of the Trobriand Islanders, and it has an inventory of classifiers of probably more than 200 classifiers. I briefly show you where I did my work. Here, this is the map of, that is Queensland of Australia. Here is the eastern part of the island New Guinea. This is an independent Papua New Guinea with its capital Port Moresby. When I arrived in Port Moresby, I first had to fly down to Alotau, that's here. That is the capital of the Milne Bay province. There I had to make my kotao to the governor in order to make sure that I got my research permits every year. And then I flew over to the Trobriand Islands here. And here we have the Trobriand Islands enlarged. the Tropen Islands are very well known by Bronislaw Malinovsky, an anthropologist who did research there between 1916 and 1918, and basically founded modern cultural anthropology there. He was up there in Umarakala, I don't get up here, and then I come down with an airplane from Alotau on the main island on Kiribina. Then I go to Losuya, and then I have my, usually on a truck, in Losuya I have my dinghy with my outboard engine. Then I check everything, whether everything is fine. Then I check whether I could find some people who would like to go over to Kailiuna Island, because it's absolutely insane to be on the Pacific as one person in a boat. That's a very nice form to commit suicide. Then you go over to Kailiuna. If the sea is still, which rather rarely happens, it takes you 45 minutes. If the sea is harsh, which I experience most often of the time, it takes 1.5 hours, and then I come up on the, to the northernmost village on Kailiuna Island, Tauima, and that was the place of residence during all my studies on the tropics. In Kiliwila, there are no formal grounds which would allow to differentiate between classifiers and quantifiers. The following examples illustrate the use of numeral classifiers for this language. The examples first present the classifier, na, in its connotation animals, and then illustrate a part of the noun modifying group of classifiers that specify the noun with respect to its quantity, its order, its agreement, and its condition or state. Sorry, I forgot my. So we have natalaina, that's the classifier for animal, and tala is the word for one. Natalaina, one fish. Now, we can also refer to 5 batches of smoked fish. So we have to have the classifier kevala, which means batch, drying, and the numeral lima, which means 5, and yina, again fish. So we have 5 batches of smoked fish. If we want to, that's actually one of my pet classifier, the next classifier that comes, Euler, because I give you the very complete translation in a minute. Euler lima means, Euler is the classifier for strings, lima is 5 again, and yina is fish, so we have 5 strings with string on fish. Now Euler actually translates as follows. You have a number of, sorry, is it not working? Or do you want to have improve it? No. Okay, you have, you usually have 10 fish on a string, and the string is made of natural fibers, and it goes to the gulls of the fish, and it's dotted on top. That is the correct glossing of Euler. And I think it's beautiful how elegantly the Tropen Islanders express that concept. And finally, we have something that you wouldn't like to encounter too often. Puasa lima, puasa tala yina. We have 6 rotten fish, so you have rotten 5, rotten 1, yina, and that shows already that we have a very interesting numeral system. It's a bigesimal decimal system of counting. That means you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 10 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 and 5, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 20. And then you can go on and you can count up to 9,999, and that is also the absolute number. You can't go on. Because this system is so absolutely complex, it has been completely superseded by the English number system. And this results in the interesting fact that Kiliwila is a prototypical numeral classifier system where the numerals are no longer classified because they are loan words from English. But we have the classifiers and demonstratives and adjectives, though it's still a very, very important and dynamic classifier. Classifiers concatenate, as I just said, with interrogatives, with demonstratives, adjectives, and numerals. They also make possible that we find noun deletion and ellipsis. So I give you just 2 example sentences. If you want to ask the question, how many canoes arrived? You say, Ke vila ke vaga likotasi. Ke is the classifier for wooden things. Canoes are made out of wood. therefore they classify the canoe. And now lekotasi is the marker for, L is the marker for past, E is the marker for third person, kota means arrive, and C is the plural marker. And then you can answer this question as follows: Keu, vaga, makesina, kemana, bueta, lekotasi. And you can elide or delete the vaga, the noun, or the adjective, because you have the, in the verbal expression, because you have the verbal expression in the question mark. And here the classifier refers to the vaga, keu. Now, because you know what is the referent that is wooden, you needn't repeat the noun, vaga. And then you have makesina, here you have the frame of the demonstrative, ma, na. Then you first insert the classifier for wooden things again. So the reference is clear that you can refer to the canoes. And you can here also infix the marker for plural, that is SE. And then with the adjective, you prefix the classifier for wooden things, K again, and you have manabueta as beautiful. And again, as I said, you needn't express the verbal expression again. The following example illustrates the semantic power of the Kilivila classifiers. A sentence like Kai mabuposina velatolu translates as these three pot-like swarm of sections of timber, where you have the classifier bubu, which means cut across, and you have the classifier kvela, which is pot-like. So the interesting thing is that the classifiers of Kilivila allow inherent classification. That means you can refer more than one classifier to the same referent. And this allows you to be extremely precise and extremely exact in your reference to a nominal referent. This example that I now present to you illustrates that in general, reclassification of a noun does not allow the noun to be omitted. To emphasize the different characterization of men and women on the one hand, and all villagers on the other, the nouns can hardly be omitted. If the speaker didn't use the noun tomota, people, in the last sentence, then this sentence would refer to persons of male sex only. And that would be absolutely unfair and incorrect. So we have Odavalusi esisusi tomota topaisua, Vivila nasalau tawau topubagula, tomota gala tudubahasala, kenakum vedona inuqualisi bubunesi guerra. That means you have a locative or our village with a plural marker, they live, people, the classifier for human beings, so, and the adjective verb. Then you have vila, women, the classifier for female, and the adjective for busy. Then the noun for men, tawal, the classifier for men again, topubagula, that is they are busy working in the gardens. And now you have to have the tomota. If you would not realize the tomota, as I said, the next sentence would only refer to the men. So tomota gala totobahasala, so the people are not classified human beings rude. Taga, but kena all, but kumvedona enuqualisi, they know, upunesi, manners there, good weather. That means in our village, if people taking pleasure in their work, the women are busy, the men are good gardeners, the people are not rude, but all have good manners. That was one of the first sentences I documented in very ad hoc attempts to get some speech data into my tape recorder on which I could play around to see whether I could find word boundaries and whether I could realize word classes and so on and so forth. And I think it's the only sentences of the first 20 pages I described that actually found their way into a publication. Now, let's come to the second one, the second system, namely noun classifiers, which are actually rare beasts. Contrary to numeral classifiers, noun classifiers are not a very common type of nominal classification. They are realized as free morphemes, standing in a noun phrase next to the noun itself, or within the boundaries of the noun phrase with other determinants of the noun, and they are crucially found independently of the operation of quantification, as colleague Greenwald points out. Sascha Eichenwald emphasizes that noun classifiers are a type of non-agreeing noun categorization device and that choice is determined by lexical selection. This system is found in languages of Mesoamerica, South America and Australia, and also in Austronesian, Thai, Tibetan and Austroasiatic languages, but nevertheless they are relatively rare. The following examples from the Mayan languages Yucatec illustrate the noun classifiers system. I can't pronounce this, you just have a noun classifier for man, you have a noun classifier for animal, and you have two nouns as reference. One is John, the other one is snake. So the man John saw the animal snake. Or with nouns deleted, you have just the third person marker and the noun classifier for man, and you have just the noun classifier for animal. He saw it, the man saw the animal. Note that the label noun classifier should be reserved for this particular system of nominal classification. It should not be used to refer to all classifiers in general, or specifically to numeral classifiers. They are different things, don't mix them up. Then we have genitive classifiers. Again, Colette Ringwald subsumes under this label all classifiers that are used in possessive constructions. With genitive classifiers, she refers to classifiers that other researchers label as possessive, relational, and attributive classifiers. And Ringwald defines this type as follows. It's usually bound to the mark of the possessor while semantically classifying the possessed. This classifier system selects a limited set of nouns of the language for classification. They are nouns that appear to have high cultural significance and constitute a class akin to the alienable nouns to be determined for each language. We find these classifiers in languages of the Americas, in African, Southeast Asian, and East Asian languages, and in many languages of Oceania. The following example from the Austronesian language Pohnpeian illustrates the system of genitive classifiers. Keni Mwenga, it's a classifier edible and a genitive marker for the first person, my foot. And then you have very broad, the classifier for transport, the genitive classifier for first person, and the noun for boat, and that translates as my boat. I can also, to make this a bit more clear to you, Kilivila also has 4 genitive classifiers. One classifier only refers to things that can be consumed, that is drinks and meals. So kago kaula, kago is the classifier for first person, kaula is the word for food, means my food. If I were a woman, I could refer to a doba in 2 different ways. Ula doba, that is my grass skirt, which I have put on the shelf down there, but agu doba is my grass skirt that I'm wearing. And then of course you have the inalienable things like taikegu, my leg, or inagu, who is the marker for first person possessive, that would be my mother. Well, however, I do not analyze this differentiation as a genitive classifier system, but as a system of manifesting a 4-fold series of different possessive pronoun forms, because I think it would have completely disturbed my analysis of numeral classifiers on the tokens. It's something different, and therefore I didn't look at it at the same time as I looked at the complex system of numeral classifiers. I think they are different beats, and I think it's also quite normal that you find in a number of languages in the world different classifier systems going hand in hand. Now let's come to verbal classifiers. Verbal classifiers are found inside the verb form and not like the other classifier types mentioned so far within the noun phrase structure. However, they do not classify the verb itself, but rather one of the nominal arguments of the verb. Hans-Jakob Seiler characterizes this system of nominal classification as follows. What we find in this technique is neither agreement nor selection or restriction. In both cases, there would be a certain dependency of the verb vis-à-vis the noun. Instead, we find a relation of solidarity that emanates both from the verb and the noun. No particular relational element is needed. Systems of verbal classifiers have been described for North American languages And we find these classifiers also in Amazonian, Australian, and Papuan languages. Again, Keith Allen refers to languages that use this type of nominal classification as predicate classifier systems. We find the following subtypes of verbal classifiers. First of all, we have classificatory noun incorporation. Second, we have verbal classifiers that are realized as affixes. And third, we have classificatory verb stems. Let's first look at the classificatory noun incorporation. This is a type of nominal classification. This is found, for example, in Iroquoian languages. In this system, a taxonomically superordinate generic noun, for example, vehicle, is syntactically incorporated into the verb and cross-classifies a specific noun, like truck or bus, which is syntactically governed by the verb. This is illustrated in the following example from the Iroquoian language Cayuga. I also wouldn't dare to pronounce the actual language. Skaido, I, now we have the incorporated noun vehicle, have. That means I have a Skaido. This is the noun incorporation, the vehicle trait which is underlined. Greenwald points out that the classifiers of this still transparent incorporation type are akin to noun classifiers. Now, verbal classifiers realized as affixes. For Greenwald, this type of verbal classifier is more akin by its semantics to the numeral classifier type. In Diegueño, German language spoken in Southern California, we find, for example, the following classifying prefixes. A usually indicates that the theme or the instrument of an action denoted by the verb group is a long object. So we have a mil, to hang a long object, a ul, to lay a long object on top of something, a ma, to cover a long object, to bury something. You see how soon the transition from person to object can happen sometimes. The prefix C indicates that the theme or the instrument of an action is an undetermined number of smaller objects. So you have kul, to put several smaller objects on top, chesil, to drag a bunch of objects. And the prefix tu classifies the theme or the instrument of an action as a small round object. To mil, to hang a small round object. To ul, to put on a small round object. To ma, to cover over a small round object. Classificatory verb stems. Athabascan languages, for example, have classificatory verbs whose roots provide a semantically transparent classification of the intransitive subject or transitive object. Navajo examples for the classification of nouns by classificatory verb stems are the following examples. We have, I also wouldn't dare to pronounce that. We have a word for money and the perfect lie of a round object, and that means the coin is lying there. Then we have again the noun, money, and the perfect lie of a collection, some money, small charge is lying there. And we have again the same noun, money, the perfect lie, and the classifier of flat flexible entity, a note bill is lying there. But there are also other types of classifiers. They are not so frequently found in the languages, but they are still existing. We have locative classifiers. They occur in locative phrases, and their choice is determined by the semantic character of the noun involved. That is usually the argument of a locative apposition. Locative classifiers are fused with an apposition. The choice of apposition then depends on physical properties of the noun. Locative classifiers are, as I have said, rather rare. We find them mainly in South American and Carib languages. Eichenwald quotes the following two examples with a locative classifier cat in hollow and ni in liquid from the northwest Amazonian language do. So she refers to a canoe in hollow, that means in a canoe, and she refers to water, small in liquid, in a small river. Deictic classifiers also exist. They occur with deictic elements. We find them in North American, South American, and African languages, and in Inuit languages in Eskimo. Some linguists refer to these classifiers also as demonstratives or article classifiers. Gumai, the West Chadic language of Nigeria, employs 5 deictic classifiers that obligatorily occur in the demonstrative word. Birgit Hellwig provides the following example with the deictic classifier diem, to stand. I also do not want to pronounce the language. you have nominalizers for singular, you have an adverb marker, you have the classifier for stand, and you have a proximal demonstrative, you have a focus marker, you have a color term orange, and you have a nominalizer becomes sweet. This standing one is a sweet orange tree. That's how it works. In Kumais, these classifiers grammaticalize from a form class of locative verbs consisting of 4 postural verbs: hang, move, sit, stand, and lie, and 1 existential predicate to be. Verbs and classifiers encode information about whether or not the figure maintains an orientation that extends beyond the ground, and if so, how it maintains this orientation through a point of origin, autonomously, or through fixation. In addition, they encode classificatory information in that every physical object is associated with 1 default postural form based on its canonical orientation. Now, we also have languages with more than 1 system of nominal classification, and on these languages, most recent research on classifier systems has resulted in absolutely fascinating results. As I said, it should be mentioned that languages like Tatuyo may use different systems of nominal classification in one and the same time. In the Tatuyo case, we find classifiers and noun classes. Now, we come to the open questions that are not yet answered, I think, in an appropriate way in the system of nominal classification research. Here are the open questions. Are the systems or techniques of nominal classification ranked and ordered? Is there a transition from one technique to the other? Do nominal classification systems constitute decline, as many people have argued, and as I would also argue? Why do languages have more than one of these nominal classification systems? And how do these types of nominal classification systems interact with each other? What are the bases for the differentiation of the classifying informatives? Classifiers are differentiated into classifiers, quantifiers, sorted classifiers, mensural classifiers, repeaters, echo-classifiers, identical classifiers, auto-classifiers, and classificatory particles. Are there really different categories of classifiers? Are the classifiers are the classifications of classifiers emic or etic? I would claim, maintain the requirement that to demonstrate the existence of a category, evidence of distinction in form is necessary. All these kinds of labels for classifier systems or classifiers are semantically given and are more or less ad hoc descriptions by linguists who obviously try to come up with a new word for that, or to highlight a certain aspect of this kind of classifier. But I would say, as long as there is no formal marking in a classifier or in a mensural, you can say classifier and a mensural are one and the same beast. You needn't differentiate between classifier proper and mensural. It's a classifier. One is a classifier who takes up mensural functions. Now, what about the semantic basis for the classification of nominal reference? Nominal reference are classified according to their specific characteristics. This classification is based on semantic principles and leads to a categorization of all the nominal conceptual labels. The units of this classification constitute semantic domains. Now, what are the semantic criteria for this kind of classification? Is the classification culturally determined? How do we describe and analyze how semantic domains are constituted in classifier systems and in classifier languages? And do these descriptions really reflect the dynamics of these nominal classifier systems? Fourth, functions and meanings of classifiers. Nominal classifier systems also have the function of reference tracking. Nouns in classifier languages can be characterized as nouns with generic reference. With their referential function, classifiers individualize nominal concepts. So we can say, if you just have, for example, a classifier for a word for tree, you refer to all trees in the world. But to unitize this tree thing, this tree mass with three subjects, you need the classifier. So if you have the classifier and the numeral, for example, ketalakai, you just refer to this one, this specific representative of the mass of all the trees. That is what this means. What do classifiers actually classify? Do they classify extra-linguistic reference, for example, beings, objects, states, actions, or so on, or the intra-linguistic category noun? In our descriptions of classifiers, in the noun phrase, we use sentences like, this classifier refers to this noun, or this classifier refers to this nominal referent. Both sentences may be understood as a kind of shorthand for this classifier refers to this noun, which itself is used as the expression to refer to, for example, an object in the extra-linguistic reality. Now, how do we resolve the ambiguity of these shorthand versions with respect to this reference? I think it's really very, very difficult, also philosophical problem, basically. The description of how speakers of a classifier language actually use these classifiers reveals that classifiers must be understood as formatives that can be used strategically to serve certain means and ends the speaker wants to pursue and express. Moreover, semantic domains are dynamic and interact with each other. They constitute a kind of network. Therefore, classifiers do have meaning. Now, how do classifiers achieve meaning? If a noun is classified by a certain classifier, will the meaning of the noun either influence the meaning of the classifier or vice versa? And I would like to illustrate this with the following example. An example from Kilivila. I realized that canoe can be classified by the normal wooden classifier K, but I also once overheard a sentence where the canoe was also classified by the classifier for children. And I thought, what's going on here? Huh? How come? That must have been a mistake by the speaker, but he was an excellent speaker, one of my teachers. And I show you the situation in which it was uttered, the context. And here, again, as always, in order to come up with a meaning, you need context. There is no meaning without context. Magodina, he said, Magodina Waga, that it was the demonstrative frame again, and the classifier inserted in the demonstrative frame Gudi, Waga, that was this child, canoe. And he stepped on my shoulder and said, Kugisi Magodina Waga Kikekita Kopola Waga Dindi. And what did I see? I saw there was a sailing boat with a motor engine passing our beach in Tawema, and on the back was a little dinghy. So, look at this small dinghy behind the motorboat. The Gudi referred to the image he had of the little boat as a kind of child of the big boat. So this was used metaphorically, and it's another piece of evidence how creative you can be if you really know and understand your classifier system. And by the way, whenever I went to the programs, the only thing I rehearsed after my first 3 field trips was the system of classifiers. Because in order to be respected as a good speaker of Kilivila, you have to actively use and play with at least 40 of the 88 classifiers. And so I made sure that I had them in my head before I went to the programs. Otherwise I would have lost face. Now, did the meaning of the classifier influence or change the meaning of the classified noun? Or has the meaning of the noun influenced or changed the meaning of the classifier? Or is there a kind of interactive Sprachspiel in Wittgenstein's sense, where both nouns and classifier change their meaning in and through the interaction? Can't answer the question. Can the act of referring with a classifier to the nominal referent be understood as the verbal reference to a language internal or to a language external context? Now, what about grammaticalization in classifiers? Where do classifiers come from? Graf Corbett agreed with Korylovich, who was probably the first to say they come from nouns. Now, the evidence that I found was that most, if not all, classifiers in Kilivila originate in nouns. The system was constituted by so-called repeaters, that is, nouns that are used as their own classifiers. So, if I want to refer to one night, the classifier for the one is the same as the noun, bogi tala bogi. So the noun is repeated as a classifier. In the course of time, these repeaters were changed and modified by phonological reduction. And these changes are probably mere consequences of a grammaticalization process that affects the lexical form noun and changes it into the grammatical form classifier. With some classifiers, this grammaticalization process also resulted in a semantic bleaching. For example, in the desemantization of formal nouns. Now, let's come to the end. Nominal classification, categorization, and cognitive linguistics. The rise of cognitive linguistics in the last decades is inextricably intertwined with research on how people and peoples classify and categorize, that is, how they organize their knowledge. Categorization is one of the main concerns of cognitive linguistics, as Gerard's definition reveals. And he gives the following definition. Cognitive linguistics is an approach to the analysis of natural language that focuses on language as an instrument for organizing, processing, and conveying information. Methodologically speaking, the analysis of the conceptual and experiential basis of linguistic categories is of primary importance within cognitive linguistics. It primarily considers language as a system of categories. The formal structure of language are studied not as if they were autonomous, but as reflections of general conceptual organization, categorization principles, processing mechanisms, and experiential and environmental influences. Given this definition, it is obvious that systems of nominal classification are not only of special interest for, but also clearly in the focus of cognitive linguistic research. The techniques of nominal classification provide indeed rich sources of data that we have concerning the structure of the conceptual categories as they are revealed through language. In what follows, I would like to illustrate this with a complex system of classifiers in Kili-Vila, the language of the Trobriand Islanders. The Trobriand Islanders belong to the ethnic group of the northern Masim. They are gardeners, yams gardeners, doing slash and burn cultivation. They are excellent carvers, canoe builders and navigators. Their society is matrilinear, but their rule of residence is very local. The language, as I have told you, is called Kili-Vila. It's an Austronesian language. It's West Melanesian Oceanic within the Papuan Tit cluster. It's an agglutinative language with a very free word order, but the word order that is the basic one, the unmarked one, is free orders. This gives you an idea of my field site, that is the village of Tauima, with one of my houses here with the open door out to, as an outside to the beach. I say one of my houses because my houses usually are eaten up by my co-inhabitants, little nice insects and other things that crawl and make a lot of noise during the night, because I do not have an open fire in my house. If you have an open fire in your house, the houses last for up to 7 or 8 years. I didn't dare to have an open fire in my house because at the side of my house usually was a big can of kerosene and of gas and of oil. So I didn't want to be my own terrorist and clone. Kili-Vila is a language with an inventory of probably more than 200 classifiers. On the basis of my own field research, I analyzed and described in detail 88 of these classifiers that are used by the inhabitants of Tauima, by field site and village of residence in Kalimantan Island. Like speakers of any classifier language, the speaker of Kili-Vila must classify all nominal denotata, an infinite set probably, with classifiers that may in theory be infinite, but in everyday speech constitute a finite set of formatives. Thus, the statements that classifiers are linguistic correlates to perception and linguistic classifiers relate people to the world are plausible and convincing. The 88 classifiers produced by the inhabitants of Tauima constitute 20 semantic domains. I have shown that these semantic domains are dynamic and interact with each other. They can be understood as program clusters, procedures, or scripts that constitute complex networks. Furthermore, they can be interpreted as categories that native speakers have developed and are still developing, by the way, in order to order their perceived world as it is encoded and represented in the nominal denotator of their language. This interpretation assigns to the semantic domains consulted by the classifiers the status of linguistic manifestations of tropian classification and categorization of their world. The questions to be raised now are the following. Do the linguistic manifestations of the tropian perception of the world allow any kind of influence to tropian cognition and to tropian culture? Do these categories frame tropian thought in a Goffman sense? Do these linguistic manifestations of the tropian perception represent universals of human cognitive processes, or do they merely represent language or culture-specific characteristics of tropian thought? My analysis of these domains have shown that most of the concepts incorporated in them are quite general and seem to be universal for human speech communities. However, the distinction of these domains has also shown that these probably universal categories are defined in a culture-specific way. As the Kilivila classifier system illustrates, the hierarchical order and the culture-specific definitions of instantiations of these probably universal semantic domains or categories or concepts give us a good deal of information about the speaker's culture. They certainly frame the speaker's perception, their kind of perceptive awareness, and their preferred ways of thinking, at least to a certain context. However, this does not imply that these frames cannot be broken or changed if the speech community feels a need to do so. Thus, my analysis of the Kilivila classifier system confirms Slobin's general remark, which I already quoted in my first lecture, that we can only talk and understand one another in terms of a particular language. The languages that we learn in childhood are not neutral coding systems of objective reality. Rather, each one is a subjective orientation to the world of human experience, and this orientation affects the way in which we think while we are speaking. Keeping Gerard's definition of cognitive linguistics in mind, and given this relationship between thinking and speaking, it is no wonder that classification and categorization as basic cognitive processes are central topics for and in cognitive linguistics. The system of nominal classification in the languages of the world offer cognitive linguistics a great empirical basis for the study of how speakers of natural languages categorize and classify their world, and how they use this categorization and classification processes for the organization of their communicative needs. Thank you. Well, any questions?
We have plenty of time, roughly 40 minutes. But because I'm the moderators, I have the privilege to ask the first question. May I?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. There's one thing. In Kilivila, the word order of a classifier construction is you have classifier first, and then you have the numeral, which is opposite from Mandarin that most of us speak. So in Mandarin, you would say one classifier fish. Yeah? You should nod if you understand. 一条鱼, one classifier fish. But in Kilivila, you say classifier, numeral, fish. So in Mandarin, it will be 条一鱼. Yeah? Alright. Now, the indigenous numeral system in Kilivila, therefore, is also different from Mandarin. So in Mandarin, you will say 100. Yeah, you'll say 100. You have the multiplier first, and then the multiplicand, the numeral base. So in Kilivila, the numeral system is also opposite. So instead of 100, you'll say 101.
No, you would say 100.
Oh, okay. They use two then. Okay. So you would say 102.
No. Yeah. Well, you have an own numeral word for the decimals. You would say 100, and this is not. It has nothing to do with the multiplication.
Okay.
You have a fully fledged numeral that translates as 100, and then you come with 101.
Okay. Let's use
Classifier 100, classifier 1, then you have 101. Classifier 100 and classifier 2, then you have 102. You do not have 100 and 200 with a marker of 2.
Okay.
It's a fully fledged numeral, like in English and German. 100, 200, 300. You do not have the multiplication index there. It's a word that just...
I understand, but the word order is opposite from English, right? The word order. In English, you'll say 100, 200, 300.
Yeah.
In Kilivida, do you say...
You have a word for 100, yeah?
And for 200, you have an entirely different word?
Yeah, exactly.
There's no relation
No.
between the two words?
No.
How about 10? How about 10, 20, and 30?
You have 10, 20, and 30, and there's no relation whatsoever with other things?
There's no relationship between the number 20 and 30?
No. Wow. Yeah, it's a different classifier system. It doesn't fit, unfortunately, that's the only thing.
All right.
Where I read your paper and said,
yes,
it's a counterexample.
Okay, so that's even better because counterexamples are always good. Right.
Yeah.
Therefore, my question is this then. When they switch to English, because in Kilabida you will say classifier 1, and then fish. And in English, when they switch to English, how do they say 100 fish?
Just as you say, 100 jena.
So they will say classifier.
No, without a classifier.
Without a classifier.
Yeah, because the English system has no classifier system, but the English system has been taken over as a loan system by the European Islanders because their own system is too complex. And therefore they just would say 100 jena.
Great, in that case, where's Momo? Momo is not here? It's just 4. In that case, it is not a counterexample because when you say 100, then you do not use the classifier.
No, but you get it wrong. The indigenous system is completely different. That is why I said we've come up with that strange fact that a paradigmatic numeral classifier system has no classifiers in its numerals anymore because they take over the English system.
Okay, I understand.
So you can't say anything about classifiers once you talk about numerals that are now English numerals in Kilivida.
I understand.
The classifiers do not play a role whatsoever.
Great.
Only in demonstratives and in adjectives.
I just want to get audience involved. If you're not following the conversation, please raise your hand. If you're not following the conversation, I don't believe it. Everybody follows the conversation?
That's obviously because you're so good at it.
Seriously? Geez, really? That's great, wonderful. All right, so I've tossed the brick. Please give me the jade. As a Chinese saying, I throw out a bad question. Hopefully I can seduce some good questions. 抛砖引玉, if you didn't get it. All right, the floor is now open.
Chinese has like a general classifier, good, right? So I was wondering if the Kilivida people also have like a general classifier, if there's like some kind of distributional pattern, maybe like one kind of classifier, like a few like occur very frequently while other ones are super specific.
Yeah, exactly. You have a general classifier because well, you have to see the complexity of the system. I just documented 88 of these classifiers in the daily news of 60 different informants representing 5 different age groups, representing half male, half female. In order to learn this system, the children have to get a start. And also the guy who comes to the field has to get a start. Therefore, the first thing that I learned was that whenever I would like to ask for what is this, you just use the following expression, avacha beya. And then you just give a deictic gesture. You can do that with your foot, you can do that with your eye, with your shoulder, whatever. But you have to have a deictic gesture. if you don't have the bear, then you have to have a demonstrative pronoun. And once you come up with a demonstrative pronoun, you have the problem that you have to know the system of classifiers. So what do these poor kids do when they learn it? They start to learn it rather late. The first classifiers show up at the age of 4. And the first classifiers are the classifiers na and to, that is male, female, na, to is male, and then you have the general classifier, which is kwe, and means thing. You know this thing I was talking about, this thing, you know, thing. What we also have sometimes when we have difficulties in finding a word. But this is the first attempt to make sure that children that acquire Kilivila as their mother tongue have a starting point. They can use at least grammatically correct means of word formation, but of course they are not elegant. And the older they get, the more elegant they get. And the interesting thing again is the acquisition of classifier explodes at the age of 12. Then suddenly you have up to 20, 30 classifiers, and then in the years up to becoming an adult, the classifiers are really built up in a very clear way, mostly because of the interaction with other adults. When fathers and uncles expect their children to come with them to the garden and help them gardening, when mothers really take the little girls and say, now you are responsible for your young siblings and you also should help me to cook and cook, all these kind of things. Then come the very specific classifiers. And then you have to also keep in mind, there are some classifiers that some people may hear, but that some people have to learn that they are not allowed to use them in a serious context, because these classifiers are markers of the two highest clan members in an extremely hierarchically stratified society. The Kilivila society has four main clans, which are subdivided into subclans again, and only the first two clans have political power, and they also mark and indicate their political power by the use of certain specific classifiers that use, in the good old Labodian sense, that are used as sociolinguistic variables that mark class or standing. And then you just see, without that general classifier, there would be no way for the children to get into the system. And that was also my way of getting into the system. And therefore, I really was always eager to make sure that I had my good inventory of classifiers, but otherwise I would have been derided as, oh, Gunter, I thought you had learned it properly. Still don't know it.
Does the language still use repeater classifiers?
Yeah.
Still?
Yeah.
Okay.
And new classifiers come in as repeaters.
A new classifier?
Yeah.
Oh.
But it's always a question whether the speech community accepts it or not.
Okay.
You can always try out. If you are lucky, it's accepted by the others, and you have a new classifier.
Did you mean that if you have a new object, say computer,
Yes.
say if you introduce a new noun, say computer into the language, and it's very difficult to classify this new object, then you can just use
Computer.
So, yeah. So in a way,
Computer, mana better computer.
Yeah.
The beautiful computer. It's a question whether they accept it.
Okay.
And if it's accepted, it's usually accepted by the two highest clans. Then you have good chances. But it can also be not accepted because they think that was invented by a common act, no chance.
I see. So there's some social linguistic factors in
Yeah.
it too.
Yeah.
Okay.
And do they have dogs?
Yeah.
So would they classify a dog as like male or maybe
No.
thing or female
Animal.
or
Animal. Simply an animal.
okay.
Yeah. But they make a difference between wild pigs. They differentiate boar and sow. I have no idea why. Maybe because in former times the wild pigs were really fierce and nasty, and many people were killed in the bush for them. And that was probably, be careful of the boars. The sows are not so important, but the boars. Okay? Yeah, please.
Thank you. you were talking about the acquisition of the classified system. I was wondering, how come they didn't start, they started developing that at the age of 4, but then they didn't master it until 12 years old. But I was wondering, because it's kind of interesting, because in terms of language acquisition, if that's something that's intrinsic to language, then they should be able to acquire it earlier, because the adults use that all the time. So how come they didn't really master it until 12 years old? That's really interesting.
Well, it's really an explosion. The first classifiers are there at the age of 4. Then, at the age of 8, you get other classifiers that are important for everyday interaction. You get, for example, the classifier for child, goody, to make self-references of a child, or to make a reference to another child, which is important because these child groups in Kili-Vila, on the Tropic Islands, are extremely independent. When a child is weaned, it has to find its world into the children groups. Up till it can walk, it had all the time contact with a mother or someone else, and if it was crying or so, it usually was breastfed. And as soon as the child can learn, it really experiences a trauma. Because now, the postpartum taboo is over. As soon as a child can walk, they think the child will survive. Now they can think of having sexual intercourse again. This means the child has to find its way into the children group, and they are, as I said, extremely autonomous, and they are a very important socialization device. The children are first and foremost socialized in their own children groups by older children. And in the course of their coming of age, they get the positions of leaders, for example, and take over the responsibilities they had to respect when they started in the child group. So they have to be able to also refer to their mates in the group. So you have goody. Then you have classifiers that refer to things in the sea, things in the bush, and numbers and states of these things, like wasa, for example. They have to learn if a fish thinks you shouldn't eat it. So therefore they just very pragmatically and very naturally acquire classifiers. And then between 8 and 12, that is the explosion here. And I really have no answer why. But I can only refer studies, language acquisition studies in classifier languages are rather rare. And I think I found about 6 or 7 studies. And the interesting thing is that I'm not the only one who makes that strange observations. So obviously it takes some preparation. I say it's cognitive linguistics what I'm doing here. It takes obviously some preparation for the brain to unitize these things and to realize what it means to unitize and to make these special references. In the beginning, you are happy if you just can say dog and everything is a dog, or papa and everything is a papa, or mama and everything is a mama. But it's obviously a very complex process for speakers of a classifier language to really handle the system in a proper way. Who else?
Xiaohui, you can ask a second question. You're looking at me, you're sort of yearning.
Well, I must say, I'm wowed by this speech, because, I'm doing neurolinguistics, I'm doing conceptual system as well. But I'm also doing classifier system. And I'm always wondering, because, as you said, it's probably a philosophical question, more of a philosophical question than a linguistic question. That is, I'm thinking about the question like every day. Sometimes it's really hard for me to know how language operates on top of the conceptual system. I mean, some people think that we have the core of concepts, and language is just a label of that concept. But when we talk about all these classification systems, we know that it's something that's on top of the conceptual system, and you should operate, or we should be influenced by it. So I just want to, I want to know your view about how these two, the conceptual system and the language system, they interact with each other.
Obviously in a very strong form of interaction, because one creates the other, and vice versa. I think that it's a continuous exchange of influences, that language shapes the conceptual system, and the conceptual system then realizes, oh, but there are things I want to express And if I just have this concept, it's impossible for me to give a more concise reference. So I have to refine my concept. And the reason for refining the concept comes from the inadequacy of the speech. So if you refine the concept, you provide basis for speaking again, and you think for speaking. That is, I do not know how it really functions. And I wonder whether we ever will find out, given all the nice fMRI studies or whatever, whether we really find out what's really going on in these processes. You can say there are a number of plausible interpretations of the interaction of mind, brain, and language. And, well, they are plausible. I wonder whether they ever will be falsifiable. And that's where I'm really also frustrated, because I'm an old proparian, and whenever I have a hypothesis, I want to falsify it. That's what I learned. You come up with a hypothesis, you do not try to verify it, you try all your best to falsify it. And if you can't, then you can say, it's quite likely that.
I think to complicate the things a bit more, it's possible we have three systems. One is universal, which most likely is born with us. Yeah, if you believe in universal cognition or universal language. The second one is built in our language. Right? Say in Mandarin, we have a particular classifier for hats, and also for sedan, 轿子. So you can say one hat, 一顶帽子, or 一顶轿子. You have to ask the question why. Why do we have a one particular class for hats and sedans, right? But the third system is scientific. Once we go to school, then we realize 木鱼 is an instrument. It is not a fish. But if you go on Google, you'll actually see 一尾木鱼. It's probably produced by a child, not knowing that 木鱼 is actually some kind of wooden drum, used by Buddhist monks. The three systems interact and influence each other. My guess is that the universal system comes first, and then comes the linguistic system, which is also cultural, and then the scientific classification, and then sort of backwashes the previous two, kind of like that. Our next question comes from our host, Professor Gawai. Oh, and Xiaohui, do you have another question? No? You start your turns.
But you can think of new ones.
So Gunter, in relation to the theme of this lecture series, cultural subjectivity, so I think your topic today has a very direct relationship with cultural subjectivity. But as you said, it's really difficult to find cultural reality in the classification system. But you did mention some connection between the classification system in Canovilla and also the culture. Can you show us with some examples to show the direct relation between the two?
Yeah, just my pet example with Euler. Who else in the world would think of referring to 10 fish? Well, first of all, count 10 fish and put them on a string. Make sure that the string is not a modern string, but a liana or whatever. Then knot it and then refer to this construction as Euler. That is so culture specific. I can't think of a more culture specific example in Kilikila. And actually, I would say we may start with the assumption that are universal necessities in classification. However, what we see, the more we get into the systems, the more we see that these universal necessities are realized linguistically in a quite culture-specific way.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good example to show the connection between the classification system and culture. If the language has other classification systems that do not have a strong semantic basis, then is there one way to see?
I don't understand what you mean with the strong. Sorry, I don't understand what you mean with the strong semantic basis here.
You mentioned something like a classification system related to 20 semantic domains.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can imagine the connection between the semantic domains and culture.
Yeah. Then I must say I probably haven't defined this thing properly. I realize that I can subclassify my classifiers in 20 semantic domains. Usually that is where a linguist stops. I've made a nice classification. I could order the classifiers according to various semantic domains. I've done a good job. That's not true. Because if you know the system, you realize that people do not stick to the semantic domain if they want to classify reference that belong to that domain. They just play with the things. They take classifiers from other domains in order to, like the Buddhi example that I show you, that is the domain of human beings and age. And they refer to the domain of good things with a classifier from human beings, Magodina Vaga, this childlike canoe. So you see that it's not a static system. Speakers use their classifier systems in an absolutely creative way. And it's the problem of the researcher to find out the dynamics of these systems. And what I did was I just checked what kind of classifiers I classified as belonging to a certain domain. And then I saw what kind of classifiers come into the domain from another semantic domain, and what classifiers of this one domain go over to other semantic domains to classify. And then you can find out what actually belongs to a semantic domain, it's namely the classifiers that were defined as constituting that semantic domain, but then also the classifiers that come from other domains into the domain. And then if you come up with these classifiers, you just have to do mathematics basically. You have to come up with variable rules of realization, and these rules of realization are probabilistic rules. And then on the basis of these probabilistic rules, you can decide what is really happening in a so-called semantic domain and what classifiers actually constitute a semantic domain. Because the first thing was your ethic approach, but you have to see what the people do, and this is the emic approach. You have to see what speakers are doing actually if they want to express a certain concept. And this is highly dynamic, and it was a lot of work, believe me. May I just have another one?
Sure.
Just another thing with respect to the culture subjectivity in classifiers. We have a classifier that I quoted here that refers to animals. Animals, all kinds of animals. However, the classifier na is also used to refer to females. The classifier na is also used to refer to corpses. And the classifier na is also used to refer to stars. So how come? Can we find any kind of reason why we have these various classifiers? I cannot explain the fact why females and animals belong to this, have the same classifier. So let's forget about the animals. Let's look at the other reference, the animals, the stars, the corpses, and that was everything. Yeah. So if you know something about Tropian eschatology, you know that, for example, the Tropian Islanders have a myth they are aware of. They know that this is not fact, but the myth says that you do not need the semen of a father to create a child. A child is a baloma, a spirit of the dead, that lived in underworld in very good and beautiful situations, and then decides to be reborn again. And then the baloma swims to a village and if a woman is bathing there and is not very attentive, it suddenly snatches into her body. And the semen of the father is only used to make the child growing big. They all know that it's nonsense because they had contraceptives, natural contraceptives. But this is a nice myth. And the myth belongs to the idea of eschatology. That's where we can see why there is a connection probably with the women to the corpses. Because the corpses then remain, but the Paloma goes back to that underworld paradise in Tuma. And then, if you know that the Tropianers realize if a Paloma, a spirit of the dead, is so frustrated that it doesn't want to have all the time that circle to be reborn, and then to go back to Tuma again, and then to be reborn again, and go back to Tuma again. What Paloma then can do is two things. Can become, or she can become a special shell or a star. And there you have the connection with the star. This is something that you have, where you have to know culture. Otherwise you have no idea why they have the same classifiers. And this is also, I think, a very, very good plea to see that you cannot describe such a system, as you said, as an armchair linguist. You have to be there. You have to know the people. You have to talk about their ideas and their convictions and their norms, and then you can start to analyze these things. Sorry.
So, an easier question for the audience who speak Mandarin is, so why does Chinese has a classifier D for hats and sedans? Hats and 轿子 sedan. So why does Chinese has one unique classifier for that? Anybody? Do we have a Chinese major here? If you're a Chinese major and you are too shy to raise your hand, please raise your hand. This is my theory, okay? Hats and sedans, they both have a top, right? And why do you have a single classifier for them? Because in ancient times,
you simply have to take one look at the person's hat or his or her sedan, then you know the person's social class. So it's very important. It's very important to recognize the person's social rank, because you behave in a wrong way, then you get your head chopped off. Yeah? So very important. Got it. All right? We still have a few minutes.
Mr. Rick.
To what extent, because people, we have been talking about numeral classifiers mainly now, but to what extent do you think there is a relation between numeral classifiers and nominal classifiers? And I'm asking this because you just said, I have no idea about the relationship, why women and animals would be referred to by the same classifiers, but I still remember in some Australian languages, nominal classifiers, they also conflate those two concepts, and there is good reason for this, because lots of there is a conflation. I mean, in some traditional societies, men were considered, patriarchal societies, men have a higher status than women. That's the explanation that's often given, are somehow closer related to livestock, I want to say. That sounds a bit weird, but it's actually what people would kind of often think.
What do you mean with nominal classifiers? Do you mean noun classifiers?
Noun classifiers,
okay.
Yes.
That is, it's a very tricky thing, because I've never really understood the difference between numeral classifiers, so-called numeral classifiers, and noun classifiers. I think the only differentiation that I think is plausible is that numeral classifiers are always, at least in numeral classifier languages, are always morphemes that are connected in some way or another with a numeral or an adjective or a demonstrative. Whereas the noun classifiers are always words in their own right. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why why these systems are relatively rarely found, because this gives a much stronger impact on the classification preferred by the speaker than if it's just part of the word. It really flashes out classification, classification, classification now. But that is my only answer to that. I have no idea why first of all, these systems are rare, and second, why the noun classifier is a word in its own right, whereas the numeral classifier is usually an affix.
There seem to be, especially on the basic level, there seem to be certain correspondences in how they segment the semantic spaces. So it's usually something like human, animal, lower animal, and something else.
But I think with this differentiation of the noun classifiers, the classification is made more important and also more harsher. I can only see that it makes a bigger section in the perception and the things perceived than the classifier. I think with the classifier you have always the possibility to reclassify it. Once you come up with a noun classifier, you have the noun classifier. You can't make the temporary classification. Once you have classified it as with a certain noun classifier, it's classified in a special drawer, and you open it up, you found it, and you close the drawer, and it's gone. But that is just interpretation and speculation. I don't have any kind of sound empirical analysis that would justify that interpretation. But I must say, I simply don't know.
Somebody back there had a question. I saw a hand earlier, before Professor Rick. Yeah, yes, sir.
Can you use a mic? Sorry.
Thank you, Professor. I was looking at the domain that you list in Note 9. I think it's quite interesting. I was thinking, how do they count something abstract, such as dreams, feelings, or thoughts? Do they count something like that? Or do they have some specific classifier for that?
Well, if the things are terribly abstract, you will use the general classifier. And only if things are introduced through the culture and get more and more familiar, you will try to come up with a new classifier. And again, this is something that depends on the speech community. For example, it's basically the same with the loan word. The Tropen Islanders never had trousers, and then they got second-hand clothes, and they also got clothes that were important, by the way, from China, from Red China, and trousers became quite popular, but they had no word for them. So what did they do? They knew that they were in trouble because they were sold in English as trousers, but the Tropen Islanders cannot produce consonant clusters. So they tried to come up with a transcription into Kilivila, and they ended up with Tara Utusi. That's the word for trousers. And the classifier for trousers is Kwe, or was Kwe at the beginning. Then they realized it's probably not the best classifier. It's something abstract, but let's look at what kind of characteristics trousers have. Well, trousers are flexible. Well, we have a classifier for flexibility. That's Ya. So you had Yatala Tarautisi. No longer Kwetala Tarautusi, but Yatala Tarautusi. Flexible one trouser. And they were happy with that. And that's how a classifier got assigned to a new loan word. Does this answer your question? You know, these are things that sound terribly anecdotal, but I think much of things that gradually enter the speech community must seem anecdotal to an observer, although he or she comes regularly. Between 1982 and 2012, in these 30 years, I had 60 field trips to the Trobriands, long and short-term field trips, and I stayed for more than 4.5 years on the islands. I can rightly claim that my Kiliwila is much better than my Dutch. You know, I work in a German institute in the Netherlands, but the main language in that institute is English. Although I have some Dutch friends there, so with them I talk Dutch. But I never could be able to give a lecture or to write something or to give even an official speech in Dutch. I can do that in Kiliwila without any problem. And I rely on my own orthography. Which has been accepted, by the way, by the missionaries. That was a very crucial thing. The missionaries had to accept it. Otherwise you can forget about all your work. Okay.
Any more questions? Oh, our host would like to reserve her right to ask the final question.
We have Slavic specialists in this room, like Yelas. Do you know that your language that you're working on does not have a classifying system? Gunter says Slavic languages do not have classifier systems. So my question is, Gunter, do you have any idea why languages do not develop classifying systems?
Well, I have no idea what they have done during the course of the time. I just can say that there is a number of research, especially the research that was done by Hans-Jakob Seiler, who claim that there is a kind of line in the way that Colette Greinwald said it. You have these berry-like things and tree-like things, and then you come up with classifiers of a certain complexity, and then, and here we come to the interesting thing, then usually classifier systems grammaticalize into gender systems. And I have no idea about the history of Slavic. I even have no idea about the really about the history of Germanic languages. But it can well be that gender systems had different systems before, but in the course of the time, they developed out of other systems. I have no idea. It would need a historical linguist to answer your question. I can't. I just can say that there are very, very clear indications about grammaticalization theories in that line. And at the end, we find gender systems. Well, noun classes first, and then gender systems. And as I said, most recent research, especially research that has been done by the Surrey group by Greville Corbett, they have looked at languages that were said to be either gender languages or that were said to be either numeral classifier languages. And they found out that a very close analysis showed that they actually had kept up a kind of mixed system, where you have features in the gender system that are clearly classifier systems and features in the classifier systems that also are clearly gender systems. So this may shed some more light into what's really going on in our ways of classification, and I think this also is something that has to be connected with cognitive studies. That's all I can say.
Being a person who has worked on numeral classifiers in the world's languages for the past 10 years, I can assure you, for the past 2 hours, you have gotten the best introduction to non-numeral classification you can get in the world. Please thank Professor Senft once again.
Thank you for your saturating.
No, seriously.
And thank you very much for your good questions and for your attention.